In the halls of the British Parliament in 1738, a most unusual piece of evidence was presented to justify war. Inside a simple glass jar, preserved in brine, floated a human ear, severed, blackened by time, yet somehow still recognizable. This grotesque relic would become the catalyst for a conflict that would consume two empires and cost over 20,000 lives. The story begins 7 years earlier in the treacherous waters off Cuba, where tensions between British merchants and Spanish colonial authorities had reached a boiling point. These Caribbean seas, rich with trade winds and Spanish silver, had become a battleground of competing empires. Every merchant vessel that sailed these waters risked more than storms and pirates. They faced the wrath of Spanish guardacostas. On April 9th, 1731, Captain Robert Jenkins commanded the merchant brig Rebecca as she sailed from Jamaica toward London, her hold filled with sugar and her captain dreaming of profit. The morning sun promised fair weather and favorable winds. Neither Jenkins nor his crew could imagine that this routine voyage would spark a war between two of Europe's greatest powers, or that Jenkins' own flesh would become a weapon of imperial politics. The Spanish Empire in 1731 jealously guarded its American colonies through a complex system of trade restrictions and naval patrols. Under the Asiento system, Spain maintained strict control over Caribbean commerce, viewing British merchants as smugglers and interlopers. Spanish guardacostas, Coast Guard vessels, patrolled these waters with royal authorization to search, seize, and punish foreign traders who violated colonial trade laws. The practice of searching British vessels had become increasingly brutal and arbitrary. Spanish captains, emboldened by colonial officials and motivated by potential prize money, subjected British sailors to beatings, torture, and imprisonment on the slightest suspicion of illegal trading. These confrontations created a growing catalog of grievances that British merchants reported to Parliament, each incident adding fuel to anti-Spanish sentiment in London's coffee houses and trading halls. Captain Jenkins represented a new breed of British merchant adventurer, men who challenged Spanish monopolies in pursuit of profit and national glory. These traders operated in the gray areas of international law, carrying legitimate cargoes while sometimes engaging in contraband trade. They viewed the Caribbean not as Spanish territory, but as open seas where British commerce had every right to flourish under the protection of growing Royal Navy power. In London, Parliament buzzed with debates over British rights in American waters. Members of Parliament heard increasingly alarming reports of Spanish aggression against British subjects, each incident carefully documented by the South Sea Company and other trading interests. The British government faced growing pressure to defend national honor and commercial interests, while diplomatic channels with Madrid remained frustratingly ineffective in addressing merchant grievances. The stage was set for confrontation between two imperial systems, Spanish colonial exclusivity versus British commercial expansion. Neither empire was prepared to compromise on fundamental principles. Spain insisted on absolute control over its American territories, while Britain demanded free trade and protection for its merchants. The collision of these incompatible worldviews would soon find its spark in one man's mutilated flesh. When Spanish Guardacosta captain Julio Leon Fandino intercepted the Rebecca off the coast of Cuba, the encounter followed a familiar pattern of intimidation and search. However, something went terribly wrong during the confrontation, whether through calculated cruelty, sudden rage, or deliberate intimidation. Fandino's crew committed an act that would be remembered across two continents. They severed Captain Jenkins' ear, creating a symbol that would unite British public opinion. The exact circumstances of Jenkins' mutilation remain disputed by historians, but the political impact was undeniable. Spanish accounts suggested Jenkins resisted search and threatened Spanish authority, justifying harsh treatment. British versions portrayed an unprovoked assault on a peaceful merchant conducting lawful trade. Regardless of the truth, Jenkins carefully preserved his severed ear in a jar of brine, perhaps already understanding its potential value as evidence of Spanish barbarism. Jenkins returned to London in 1731, but initially chose not to publicize his injury. The political climate was not yet ripe for war, and Prime Minister Robert Walpole pursued peaceful relations with Spain despite merchant complaints. Jenkins filed his report with authorities and resumed his trading activities, carrying his preserved ear as a gruesome reminder of Spanish justice. The wound healed, but the political implications remained dormant, waiting for the right moment. By 1738, anti-Spanish sentiment in Britain had reached a fever pitch. New incidents of Spanish aggression, combined with economic difficulties and political opposition to Walpole's Pacific policies, created perfect conditions for war hysteria. Merchants, opposition politicians, and naval officers united in demanding action against Spanish outrages. Into this volatile atmosphere, Captain Jenkins finally emerged with his preserved ear, ready to testify before Parliament about Spanish cruelty in American waters. On March 17, 1738, Captain Jenkins appeared before a committee of the House of Commons, carrying his jar containing the withered ear. Members of Parliament listened with fascination and horror as Jenkins described his treatment at Spanish hands 7 years earlier. When asked what he thought during the assault, Jenkins allegedly replied, "I commended my soul to God and my cause to my country." The room erupted in demands for satisfaction and revenge. Jenkins' testimony provided the emotional catalyst that Walpole's opponents needed to force Britain toward war. The image of a British captain's ear floating in brine became a powerful symbol of national humiliation that demanded response. Opposition speakers used Jenkins' mutilation to argue that Spanish aggression had gone unpunished too long. Even Walpole, despite his preference for peace, recognized that public opinion and parliamentary pressure made war virtually inevitable. The declaration of war against Spain in October 1739 was met with celebration throughout Britain. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and naval officers dusted off their swords in anticipation of glory and prize money. Few understood that they were entering a conflict that would merge with the larger War of Austrian Succession, consuming European resources for nearly a decade. The War of Jenkins' Ear had begun with a severed appendage, but would grow into something far more terrible. British naval preparations revealed both the Empire's strengths and weaknesses. The Royal Navy possessed superior ships and experienced officers, but faced challenges of distance, disease, and Spanish fortifications throughout the Caribbean and South America. Initial strategies called for attacks on key Spanish ports, disruption of treasure fleets, and support for potential colonial rebellions. The British government allocated enormous resources to what many assumed would be a short, victorious campaign. The Siege of Cartagena in 1741 represented the climax of British ambitions in the War of Jenkins' Ear. Admiral Edward Vernon commanded a massive fleet of 186 ships carrying 23,000 troops, the largest British amphibious force assembled to that date. The attack on this heavily fortified Spanish port was designed to cripple Spanish power in South America and provide access to legendary wealth. Instead, it became a catastrophic demonstration of imperial overreach and tropical warfare's deadly realities. disease proved more deadly than Spanish resistance at Cartagena, yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery ravaged British forces faster than enemy fire, killing thousands of soldiers and sailors in the humid Caribbean climate. Admiral Vernon's initial optimism gave way to desperate attempts to salvage victory from an increasingly hopeless situation. The siege collapsed after 2 months, with British forces retreating in defeat, leaving behind thousands of graves in foreign soil. The failure at Cartagena shattered British confidence and demonstrated the limits of naval power against entrenched colonial defenses. Of the 23,000 men who participated in the expedition, fewer than 7,000 returned to Britain alive. The disaster destroyed Vernon's reputation, bankrupted the treasury, and proved that Spanish America could not be conquered through traditional amphibious assault. Jenkins' ear had unleashed forces that consumed an entire generation of British sailors and soldiers. While British forces died at Cartagena, Commodore George Anson embarked on an extraordinary circumnavigation that would become legend. His Pacific voyage, originally planned as a coordinated attack on Spanish colonial ports, transformed into a desperate struggle for survival against storms, scurvy, and Spanish resistance. Anson's capture of the Manila galleon Nuestra Señora de Covadonga provided the war's most spectacular prize, but at enormous cost in human life. By 1748, the War of Jenkins' Ear had merged completely with the War of Austrian Succession, becoming a global conflict that encompassed Europe, America, and Asia. The original grievances over Caribbean trade had been forgotten in larger questions of European balance and imperial succession. Peace negotiations at Aix-la-Chapelle restored the status quo ante bellum, meaning that 9 years of warfare had achieved virtually nothing except massive casualties and debt. The human cost of Jenkins' Ear was staggering. Over 20,000 British servicemen died during the conflict, most from disease rather than enemy action. Spanish casualties were equally severe, while colonial populations throughout the Caribbean suffered devastating economic disruption. Families across Britain mourned sons and fathers who had sailed away to avenge a captain's mutilation, only to find anonymous graves in tropical soil, thousands of miles from home. The War of Jenkins' Ear exposed fundamental problems in British imperial strategy and colonial governance. The conflict demonstrated that emotional public opinion could drive nations into costly, unsuccessful wars based on inadequate intelligence and unrealistic expectations. Prime Minister Walpole's fall from power marked the end of an era of peaceful diplomacy, replaced by more aggressive imperial policies that would characterize British foreign relations for generations. Today, the War of Jenkins' Ear serves as a cautionary tale about how small provocations can escalate into major conflicts when amplified by nationalist fervor and imperial competition. A severed ear in a jar, preserved as evidence of injustice, became the symbol that launched a 9-year war between empires. In our age of global communication and instant outrage, Jenkins' Ear reminds us that the distance between personal grievance and international catastrophe remains dangerously short.